They said nothing good ever grew on the hollow lot, but the old people of Ashford Hollow knew that land was not dead, it was only waiting for someone brave enough to listen. For 70 years, the 12 acres beyond Miller's Ridge had sat behind a sagging split-rail fence, left to weeds, rust, and stories no one wanted to repeat after sunset. Children were told not to climb over the wire. Farmers drove their tractors a long way around. Even delivery men, who trusted maps more than rumors, slowed down when they passed the black oak in the center of the field, the one split by lightning and burned halfway down its trunk, standing alone like a watchman who had forgotten how to sleep. The locals called the place the Hollow Lot because every sound seemed to sink there and come back changed. A hammer strike became a whisper. A boot step became a dull wooden knock. After a hard rain, the soil gave off a faint iron smell, sharp and cold, as if old tools had been buried beneath it, and were still trying to remember the hands that held them. No house had ever stood there for long. One family tried in the 1960s, but their well ran dry before the roof was finished. A developer came in the 1980s, promising cabins and a fishing pond, only to leave 3 weeks later without taking his equipment. By the time Caleb Whitaker first saw the land, folks had stopped calling it property. They called it a burden. Caleb arrived on a gray November morning in a dented blue Ford pickup with one cracked mirror, a toolbox in the bed, and a 6-year-old German shepherd sitting upright beside him like a soldier keeping watch. The dog's name was Rex, and he had the kind of amber eyes that made strangers lower their voices without knowing why. His black and tan coat was thick from the cold, his chest broad, his ears high, and his attention fixed on the passing fence line long before Caleb touched the brakes. Caleb was 40 years old, a white former Army combat engineer with broad shoulders, tired hands, and dark brown hair silvering at the temples. His face carried the weather of too many roads and too many quiet nights spent pretending the past had no address. He had built bridges in places where the ground could not be trusted. He had learned to read soil, stone, pressure, and silence. But since coming home, he had not been able to read his own life with the same certainty. The army had given him discipline. The years after had taken almost everything else. Work came in pieces, repairing fences, patching barns, fixing generators for people who paid in cash and sympathy he never asked for. Home had become whatever place allowed his truck to sit overnight without complaint. Rex had been the only constant, the warm breathing weight beside him when winter pressed against the windows and old memories moved through the dark like wind under a door. That morning, Caleb was not looking for a miracle. He was following the last wishes of Margaret Ellison, an 84-year-old widow whose porch roof he had repaired one stormy night without charging her a dime. She had watched him work from behind a screen door, small and wrapped in a blue cardigan, her white hair pinned neatly as if dignity were something a person could fasten in place. When he finished, she asked his name, then the dog's. Caleb told her, and Rex had walked up the steps and rested his head against her knee as though he had known her longer than either of them could explain. 3 weeks later, Margaret passed quietly in her sleep, and a lawyer from Ashford Hollow called Caleb to say she had left him something. Not money. Not a house. Not even furniture. She had left him the Hollow Lot, 12 unwanted acres beyond Miller's Ridge, along with a sealed envelope and a sentence that made the lawyer frown as he read it aloud. When Rex refuses to leave, dig. Caleb had stared at the paper for a long moment, waiting for the words to become ordinary. They did not. Now, as the pickup rolled to a stop before the old gate, the wind moved through the brown grass in low waves. The fence leaned inward. The mailbox, long emptied of purpose, hung open on one rusted hinge. Caleb stepped out, boots pressing into the damp gravel, and breathed in the cold scent of cedar, clay, and rain-soaked leaves. Rex jumped down after him but did not run ahead. He stood still, nose lifted, ears angled toward the field. Caleb noticed it at once. Rex was not afraid. Fear had a shape Caleb knew well. This was different. This was recognition. Easy, boy, Caleb murmured, though his own voice sounded too loud against the quiet. He unlatched the gate, and it gave a tired groan that rolled across the field and vanished near the burned oak. They walked in together, man and dog, past clumps of dead goldenrod and stones half swallowed by moss. The ground dipped strangely beneath their feet, not enough to see from the road, but enough for Caleb's body to feel it. 30 yards from the oak, Rex slowed. 10 yards from it, he stopped completely. His tail lowered. His head turned, not toward the tree, but toward a bare circle of earth where no grass grew at all. The soil there was dark, smooth, and hard, untouched by weeds, untouched by frost, as if something below had been breathing upward and keeping life away. Rex stepped onto the circle and froze. Then he lowered his muzzle until it nearly touched the ground. One paw lifted. He scraped the earth once, twice, 3 times. Caleb felt the air shift in his chest. The dog looked back at him, amber eyes steady and solemn. Far off, a crow called from the ridge, then fell silent. Caleb took 1 step closer, and beneath his boot, deep under the earth, something answered with a faint, hollow sound. Caleb did not move for several seconds. He had spent enough years around unstable ground to know that the earth sometimes spoke before it gave way, but this sound was not a warning crack or the soft collapse of wet clay. It was measured, deep, and strangely clean, like the note of an old bell struck far below the surface. Rex heard it too. The German shepherd's ears stood sharp against the cold sky, his body still except for the slight rise and fall of his ribs. Caleb crouched beside him and pressed 1 bare palm against the dark soil. The ground was cold enough to sting, but beneath that cold he felt the faintest vibration, not strong, not steady, but present, like a memory trying to reach the air. "What did you find, boy?" he whispered. Rex did not bark. He only looked toward the burned oak, then back at Caleb, and in that silent exchange Caleb felt the old familiar pull of trust. During his years as a combat engineer, he had learned that men survived by listening to the small things others ignored: a wire where no wire should be, a patch of earth too smooth, a wall that breathed differently in the heat. Rex had learned with him in another language, one made of scent, pressure, instinct, and devotion. The dog had once found a living man beneath a collapsed warehouse after every machine had gone quiet. He had once refused to cross a road that looked perfectly safe until Caleb noticed the unnatural curve of gravel near the shoulder. Caleb had stopped asking whether Rex understood danger. The dog understood the world in a way people had forgotten. He stood and walked slowly around the bare circle, counting his steps under his breath. 15 feet across from edge to edge. Too round to be natural. Too clean to be a patch of bad soil. The weeds grew thick along the outside of it, but nothing had taken root in the center, not even the stubborn little thistles that split Kentucky clay with their needles. Caleb pulled a folding probe rod from the back of the truck, the kind he used when checking old fence posts and underground lines. The metal was scratched, dull, and familiar in his hand. He pressed it into the earth near the edge of the circle. It sank 6 inches, then met resistance. Normal. He moved 2 feet inward and tried again. This time the rod went deeper, almost 2 feet, before striking something hard with a dry tick that traveled up his wrist. He frowned. Stone, maybe? He shifted closer to the center. Rex watched every movement, paws planted as if guarding the spot from the wind itself. Caleb drove the probe down again. 1 foot. 2. 3. Then the rod slipped suddenly, as if passing through a narrow pocket of emptiness, before touching something solid far below. The sound that came back was not stone. It was metal. Caleb pulled the rod free and wiped the wet soil from its tip. A faint reddish stain clung to the steel, not fresh, not bright, but old and mineral-heavy. He lifted it to his nose. Iron. Rain began to mist over the field, so light it seemed more like breath than weather. It gathered on Rex's fur and darkened Caleb's jacket at the shoulders. From the road behind him came the slow crunch of tires on gravel. Caleb turned as a white county cruiser pulled beside the gate. The driver stepped out carefully, a broad man in his late 50s wearing a tan sheriff's coat and the guarded expression of someone who had been hoping not to see exactly what he was seeing. "You must be Whitaker," the man called. His voice was not unfriendly, but it carried a weight that made the open field feel smaller. Caleb nodded. That is right. The sheriff glanced at Rex, then at the probe rod, then at the bare circle beside the oak. The color seemed to leave his face in a quiet, private way. I am Nolan Briggs, he said. Margaret's lawyer told me you might come out here. Caleb waited. He had learned that silence often made people tell more truth than questions did. Sheriff Briggs stepped through the gate and walked toward them, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. He stopped several yards from the circle, as if an old habit would not let him come closer. Most folks inherit land because somebody loved them, he said. Margaret did not do anything without a reason. Not even at the end. Rex gave a low breath through his nose, not a growl, but enough to make the sheriff look down. Good dog, Briggs murmured, though his eyes stayed troubled. Caleb held up the probe rod. There is something under here. The sheriff looked toward the burned oak. Its blackened branches scratched the sky like handwriting no one had managed to erase. There are a lot of things under old land, he said. Roots. Springs. Forgotten wells. This is not a well. Briggs swallowed, and for a moment the only sound was the mist ticking softly on dead leaves. How deep? Caleb studied him. I do not know yet. That was not entirely true. His hands, his training, and the hollow return through the rod had already begun forming a number in his mind, one he did not want to say until he had proof. The sheriff seemed to hear it anyway. He looked at the bare earth, then at Rex, and his voice dropped. Your dog should not have found that. The words settled over the field colder than the rain. Caleb felt Rex lean lightly against his leg, warm and steady. Found what? He asked. Briggs did not answer right away. He turned toward the road, toward the little town hidden beyond the ridge, toward all the houses where old people still lowered their voices when the Ellison name came up. At last he said, Something this town spent 70 years pretending was not here. Then he walked back to his cruiser without stepping once onto the bare circle. By the time Caleb reached the edge of town, the mist had thickened into a soft gray rain that blurred the storefront windows and turned the sidewalks dark as slate. Ashford Hollow did not look like the kind of place that could hide anything for 70 years. It had a small courthouse with white columns, a barber pole that still turned though no one was inside, a diner with warm yellow light in the windows, and flags hanging from porches with the quiet pride of people who knew every family name on every mailbox. But Caleb had learned long ago that small towns kept their secrets the way old houses kept winter, tucked into corners, held in the wood, felt more than seen. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, rain beating along the edge of his ears, his eyes fixed ahead as if the road itself were giving directions. Caleb parked in front of the red brick law office where Margaret Ellison's will had first been read. The sign on the door said Warren and Pike, attorneys at law, though Mr. Pike had apparently retired 15 years earlier, and no one had bothered to remove his name. Inside, the air smelled of paper, lemon polish, and old heat from iron radiators. Theodore Warren, a thin man in a brown cardigan, looked up from his desk when Caleb entered with Rex at his side. The lawyer's expression tightened the moment he saw the mud on Caleb's boots and the question in his eyes. You went out there, Warren said. It was not really a question. Caleb removed his cap and held it in both hands. Sheriff Briggs showed up. Warren closed the folder in front of him a little too carefully. Nolan has carried that town on his shoulders longer than most people know. He said Rex should not have found something. At the sound of his name, Rex stepped closer to Caleb's leg. The lawyer looked at the dog, and for a moment his professional calm slipped, revealing something older than worry. Mrs. Ellison was very clear about one thing, Warren said. If you came back asking questions, I was to give you the second envelope. Caleb felt the room become still around him. Warren unlocked a drawer and took out a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark green wax. The paper was thick, the kind used by people who believed words deserved weight. Across the front, in careful handwriting, was Caleb's name. Not Mr. Whitaker. Not to whom it may concern. Caleb. He opened it with the edge of his thumb. Inside was a black and white photograph, yellowed at the borders but sharp enough to make time feel close. Margaret stood in the picture as a young woman, perhaps 17, wearing a plain summer dress and holding a straw hat against her waist. Beside her stood a stern man with kind eyes, one hand resting on her shoulder. Behind them were 18 miners in work clothes, their faces tired, proud, and sun-browned, standing beneath the same oak Caleb had seen that morning, only then it had been full and green, its branches wide over the field like a blessing. Rex lifted his nose toward the photograph and gave a soft, uncertain whine. Caleb turned it over. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "We buried the truth 35 feet down because men with money feared poor men with proof." Beneath that was a second line, shakier, as if written much later. "If the shepherd listens, let the soldier dig." Caleb read it twice, then a third time, though the meaning did not become easier to hold. "What happened out there?" he asked. Warren sat slowly, his hands folded on the desk. Outside, a truck passed through a puddle with a long wet hiss. "There was a mining company," the lawyer said. "Ellison Mining. Margaret's family owned part of it. In 1954, something went wrong in the lower tunnels beneath Miller's Ridge. The company claimed 18 men had ignored orders, damaged equipment, and caused a disaster that ruined the operation. Their families lost wages, pensions, homes, reputations. Some left town. Some stayed and learned to live under whispers." Caleb looked again at the faces in the photograph. 18 men beneath a summer tree, alive in a moment before the world decided what to call them. And Margaret knew. Warren's eyes lowered. She was a girl. Her father was a bookkeeper for the company. According to what little she told me, he believed the official story was false. He gathered documents, reports, ledgers, maps. Then he hid them somewhere safe until he could decide what to do. 35 feet down, Caleb said. Warren did not nod, but his silence did. Rex paced once around the office, then stopped beside an old filing cabinet, restless, as though the past had a scent and it had filled the room. Caleb slipped the photograph back into the envelope with hands that felt heavier than before. He had come to ask about land. Instead, he had been handed faces. That changed everything. Land could be sold, ignored, fenced off, forgotten. Faces could not. As he turned to leave, Warren spoke again, softer this time. "Mrs. Ellison asked me to tell you something if you reached this point. She said you would understand ground better than most men. But more than that, she said you would understand what it means when good people are buried under the wrong story." Caleb paused with his hand on the door. Rain tapped against the glass in tiny silver lines. For years he had thought his own life had become a place no one wanted to enter, full of silence and things better left undisturbed. But Rex stood beside him now, steady and patient, and somewhere beyond town a burned oak waited over a hollow place in the earth. Caleb put on his cap. "Tell Sheriff Briggs I am going back," he said. Warren looked at him as though he had expected nothing else. When Caleb stepped outside, the rain had eased, and a pale seam of light had opened in the clouds above Miller's Ridge. Caleb returned to the hollow lot just before dusk, when the sky had turned the color of wet pewter, and the last light lay thin across the hills. The rain had stopped, but every blade of grass still held a silver bead of water, and the whole field smelled of soaked leaves, cold clay, and the faint iron breath that seemed to rise from nowhere and everywhere at once. Rex jumped from the truck before Caleb could call him, but he did not run. He moved with the careful purpose of a dog entering a place that deserved respect. His paws made no sound on the damp ground. His nose stayed low. His ears tilted forward, then sideways, listening not to the wind, but beneath it. Caleb carried the envelope inside his jacket, close enough that he could feel the stiff edge of the photograph against his ribs. 18 faces had followed him from the law office. They had ridden with him through town, past the diner, past the courthouse, past the quiet houses where porch lights flickered on one by one. By the time he reached the old gate, they no longer felt like faces in a picture. They felt like witnesses. Sheriff Nolan Briggs was already there, leaning against his county cruiser near the fence. He had removed his hat, and the mist had silvered his hair until he looked older than he had that morning. Beside him stood two other people, a woman in a green raincoat holding a clipboard against her chest, and an elderly man with a cane, his shoulders narrow but his eyes clear. Caleb recognized the woman from the courthouse bulletin board. Her name was Ellen Porter, the county records clerk. The old man was a stranger. Briggs saw Caleb look at him and spoke quietly. "This is Jonah Reed. His father was one of the 18. The old man gave a small nod, not quite a greeting, not quite permission. Caleb felt the weight of it and nodded back. No one offered a handshake. Some moments were too fragile for manners. Rex walked past them all and went straight to the bare circle near the burned oak. When he reached it, he stopped at the exact place where Caleb's probe had struck metal below. Then he sat. Not restless. Not uncertain. Waiting. Ellen Porter pressed her lips together. "Mrs. Ellison came to the records office 3 times last year," she said. "Asked about old mining plats, sealed transfers, maps from the 1950s. I thought she was settling family papers." Briggs looked toward the oak. "Margaret was settling more than papers." Caleb opened the envelope and took out the photograph. Jonah Reed lifted his chin when he saw it, and something trembled through his face, not weakness, but recognition arriving after a long journey. "That is my father," he said, pointing with one bent finger to a young man near the left edge of the group. "Samuel Reed. My mother kept one picture of him in a Bible. Same eyes. Same way of standing." His voice thinned, but it did not break. "She spent her whole life saying he was not what they called him." The field seemed to grow still around those words. Even the branches of the burned oak held their position against the evening sky. Caleb turned the photograph over and showed them the message on the back. Ellen read it aloud in a voice barely stronger than the wind. "We buried the truth 35 feet down because men with money feared poor men with proof." Jonah closed his eyes. Briggs looked away toward the ridge. Caleb folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the envelope. "I need to know what is under this ground," he said. "I need to do it safely." The old habits came back then, not as memory, but as movement. Caleb walked the circle again, marking the edges with small orange flags from his toolbox. He studied the slope of the field, the way rainwater drained away from the oak, the slight depression hidden by dead grass to the south, the unnatural firmness under the center. He asked Ellen if the county had any modern utility records for the lot. She said no electric, no gas, no water lines. Briggs called the road department and requested ground support equipment for morning, but Caleb knew waiting would be difficult for everyone standing there. The land had begun speaking. Once that happened, silence felt like another kind of lie. Rex rose suddenly and walked to the burned oak. He pressed his nose to the blackened bark, then circled to the far side, where thick roots twisted out of the soil like old knuckles. He scratched once at a seam Caleb had not noticed before, a narrow line of stones half buried in moss, too straight to be natural. Caleb knelt and brushed away wet leaves. More stones appeared, fitted by hand, forming part of an old retaining ring around the tree. At the base of one stone was a rusted metal tag, almost swallowed by earth. Caleb wiped it with his thumb until 3 faint letters emerged. E.M.C. Ellen drew in a sharp breath. "Ellison Mining Company." Jonah leaned heavily on his cane. "Then it is true," he whispered. Caleb stood slowly. The seam of pale light above Miller's Ridge had faded, and the first stars were beginning to show through the thinning clouds. Briggs turned on the cruiser headlights, washing the oak and the bare circle in a soft white glow. In that light, the field looked less abandoned and guarded, less cursed and burdened. Caleb placed one hand on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We open it carefully." No one argued. The old man with the cane took off his cap and held it against his chest. Ellen wiped rain from her cheek, though the rain had already stopped. Sheriff Briggs stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the ground as if asking forgiveness from something he had never personally done, but had somehow inherited. Rex stayed beside the oak until the moon rose faintly over the ridge. Before Caleb left, the dog lowered his head and gave one soft whine toward the earth, a sound so gentle it felt almost like a prayer. And deep below them, where darkness had held its breath for 70 years, the hollow metal answered once more. Morning came quietly over Miller's Ridge, pale and cold, with a low veil of fog resting across the fields like a blanket someone had forgotten to fold. Caleb arrived before sunrise, the truck headlights cutting through the gray, Rex sitting beside him with his ears already lifted toward the hollow lot. Neither of them had slept much. Caleb had spent half the night in the cab, the envelope from Margaret tucked inside his coat, watching the dark shape of the burned oak through the windshield. Every now and then Rex had raised his head and stared toward the field, not alarmed, not restless, but attentive in the solemn way he became when something unseen was near. By 7 o'clock, the quiet road had begun to fill. Sheriff Briggs came first, then Ellen Porter with a box of county records wrapped in plastic, then Jonah Reed in a wool coat buttoned to his throat. A road department truck followed, carrying a compact excavator, orange safety cones, and 2 workers who spoke in low voices after Briggs explained that the dig would be slow, careful, and shallow by shallow, not a careless tearing into the earth. Caleb walked the marked circle again while the sky brightened. The orange flags he had placed the night before were still there, beaded with dew. The rusted E.M.C. tag at the base of the oak looked darker in daylight, less like a clue and more like a signature left by someone who believed no one would ever read it. Rex moved beside Caleb without a leash, calm but focused. When they reached the center of the bare earth, the dog stopped, lowered his head, and touched his nose to the ground. Then he sat, as if placing himself on duty. Caleb knelt and rested a hand on his back. The warmth beneath Rex's coat steadied him. "We do this right," he murmured. The first cut into the soil was so gentle it almost felt ceremonial. The excavator bucket skimmed the surface and lifted away the top layer of dark dirt. Beneath it was clay, packed tight and streaked with red mineral lines that looked like old veins running through the earth. No one joked. No one rushed. Even the workers seemed to understand that this was not a normal job. At 5 feet, they found the first piece of timber, a squared beam preserved in the clay, blackened by age but still straight. Caleb signaled for the machine to stop, then climbed down carefully with a hand shovel. He brushed soil away from the beam and saw iron nails set in a pattern too deliberate for a fence or shed. "This was placed," he said. Ellen wrote it down in her notebook, though her hand trembled slightly. At 12 feet, the air changed. A colder breath rose from the hole, carrying the scent of wet stone, old wood, and something metallic. Rex stood at once. His body went still, his gaze fixed on the growing cut in the earth. Caleb looked at the workers and raised one hand. "Slow from here." By then, more townspeople had gathered along the fence line. They came with coffee cups, folded arms, and faces pulled tight by curiosity or worry. Some were descendants of old mining families. Some had grown up hearing that the 18 men ruined the town. Some had never believed it, but had never known how to say so aloud. Sheriff Briggs kept everyone back, though his own eyes never left the hole. At 24 feet, the bucket struck stone arranged in a flat ring. Not natural rock. Hand-laid. Caleb climbed down again, boots sliding slightly on the damp slope, and brushed the surface clean. The stones formed a collar around something deeper, a shaft or sealed access point hidden beneath decades of clay. He looked up toward Jonah Reed. The old man had both hands on his cane, his knuckles pale. "My mother said there was a lower entrance," Jonah called softly. "She said Samuel talked about a service hatch under the oak, but nobody believed her after the company men denied it." Caleb nodded once. There was nothing to say that would not sound too small. The digging continued inch by inch. The fog lifted. Sunlight touched the ridge, then the field, then the blackened side of the oak. At 31 feet, Rex gave a sudden bark, short and sharp, and the worker froze with his hand on the controls. Caleb leaned over the edge. The soil at the bottom had changed again, turning gray and dry, protected somehow from the water above. He climbed down with a flashlight clipped to his jacket and tapped the surface with the end of his shovel. A hollow note returned, clearer than before. The sound moved through everyone standing there. Ellen covered her mouth. Briggs took off his hat. Jonah lowered his head. Caleb scraped away another layer by hand. Slowly, a round steel surface emerged, wide as a kitchen table, rimmed with bolts the color of old rust. Across the center, beneath the skin of clay, were the raised letters E, M, C, and below them the year 1954. The workers lowered a ladder. Caleb descended first, not because he owned the land, but because Margaret had chosen him and Rex had led him. The dog stood at the edge above, ears forward, watching with absolute trust. Caleb set one palm on the cold steel. For a moment he thought of Margaret as a girl, of her father hiding papers in the dark, of 18 men standing beneath a green oak with their names still clean. "We found it," he said, his voice low but carrying in the morning air. No one cheered. The field held silence like a church. Then Rex gave one soft whine from above, and Caleb felt the steel beneath his hand answer with a faint breath of cold air from the seam. Caleb waited until the county workers brought down the portable air monitor and set it humming beside the steel hatch. Old ground could be unpredictable, and he would not let curiosity outrun caution. The small machine blinked green after several long minutes, its quiet beep the only sound at the bottom of the shaft. Above him, the townspeople stood along the fence and ridge in a half-circle of held breath. Morning sunlight had reached the lip of the hole, but down where Caleb stood, 35 feet beneath the burned oak, the world was blue-gray and cold. Sheriff Briggs descended next, slower and heavier on the ladder, followed by Ellen Porter with a sealed document bag and a flashlight clipped to her coat. Jonah Reed remained above. His legs were not steady enough for the climb, but his presence seemed to fill the shaft more than anyone else's. Rex stood beside him at the edge, ears high, gaze fixed on Caleb, as if the dog had become a bridge between the living and the long hidden. The hatch bolts resisted at first. Rust had sealed them with the patience of decades. Caleb worked each one loose by hand, using oil, a breaker bar, and the careful rhythm of a man who knew metal could be persuaded better than forced. One bolt turned. Then another. Then another. Each small movement made a dry, aching sound that rose through the shaft and drifted across the field. No one spoke. When the final bolt loosened, Caleb stepped back and nodded to the road crew. Together, they attached a chain to the old ring handle. The hatch lifted slowly, not with a dramatic crash, but with a long breath, as if the earth itself had been holding air inside its chest since 1954. A thin current of cold air slipped upward, carrying the smell of paper, limestone, machine oil, and rainwater trapped in memory. Caleb shone his flashlight through the opening. Below was a narrow steel stairway, dusty but intact, descending another 10 feet into darkness. On the wall beside it, painted in fading white letters, were the words Lower Service Archive. Ellen whispered the phrase as if she were reading a name from a headstone. Caleb went first. The stairs groaned under his boots, but they held. At the bottom was a chamber larger than he expected, perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, reinforced with beams and poured concrete. The ceiling was low enough that Caleb instinctively bowed his head. Shelves lined the walls. Metal file boxes sat in rows. A wooden desk stood in the center beneath a dead lamp, its green glass shade filmed with dust. On the far wall, someone had pinned a map of the Miller's Ridge tunnels, marked with red pencil and notes. So precise Caleb felt the old engineer in him wake fully. This was not a hiding place made in panic. This was an archive. A deliberate, organized room built to preserve what someone had feared would be destroyed. Ellen moved to the nearest shelf and lifted the lid of a file box. Inside were payroll ledgers, inspection reports, letters, and carbon copies tied with cotton string. Her hands trembled as she read the first page. "These are original records," she said. "Signed. Dated. Not copies." Sheriff Briggs stood near the wall of names. There were 18 of them, written in careful black paint on a board that had been mounted above a small wooden cross made from 2 pieces of mined timber. Samuel Reed was third from the top. Briggs removed his hat, though he had already removed it once above. Down here, the gesture meant something different. Caleb stepped toward the desk. On it lay a sealed tin box. The lid was marked with the initials H.E., which Caleb guessed belonged to Henry Ellison, Margaret's father. Inside was a letter wrapped around a brass key. The paper had yellowed, but the handwriting remained firm. Ellen read it aloud, her voice low and clear in the underground room. If this is found, let it be known that the men blamed for the Miller's Ridge failure did not cause it. They warned us. They wrote reports. They refused to sign false statements. The company buried their warnings because the repairs were costly and the insurance money was easier to protect than the truth. The words did not echo. They seemed to settle into the concrete, into the shelves, into every quiet face above and below. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. He had seen men carry blame that did not belong to them. He knew how a wrong story could follow a person longer than any wound, how it could move into a family, sit at their dinner table, and teach children to lower their eyes. When he opened his eyes, Rex was at the bottom of the stairs. No one had called him down. He must have slipped carefully past Jonah and followed Caleb's scent into the chamber. The German shepherd walked straight to the wall of names and sat beneath it. His head lowered, not in fear, but in stillness. Caleb looked at him, then at the names, and felt something in the room soften. Ellen took photographs of every shelf before touching another page. Briggs radioed for the State Archivist and Historical Preservation Office. Caleb found a second map showing not only the old tunnels, but a clean underground spring running beneath the east side of the property, capped and hidden when the mine closed. Beside it was a note in Henry Ellison's handwriting: "This land may one day save more than it lost, if honest hands inherit it." Caleb read the sentence twice, and the meaning came slowly, like sunrise through fog. Margaret had not left him a cursed field. She had left him a chance to carry truth into daylight. Above them, Jonah's voice called down, thin but steady. "Did you find him?" Caleb walked to the stairs and looked up toward the old man standing in the light. He thought of the young miner in the photograph, standing beneath a green oak before the world turned his name into a warning. Caleb's voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Yes, sir," he said. "We found your father. And he was telling the truth." By late afternoon, the hollow lot was no longer a forgotten field behind a leaning fence. It had become the center of Ashford Hollow, the place every road seemed to lead, the place every old story had quietly been walking toward for 70 years. State archivists arrived in dark jackets and careful shoes, carrying gloves, cameras, evidence boxes, and faces that changed the moment they descended into the chamber. They came expecting old papers. They found a room that had waited with the patience of stone. Caleb stayed near the entrance with Rex at his side, watching as each ledger, map, letter, and report was photographed before being lifted from the shelves. The dog had not left the underground room since he came down the stairs. He sat beneath the wall of names, calm as a church bell after ringing, his amber eyes following every movement but never showing fear. Above them, the townspeople had grown quiet. The morning crowd that came for curiosity had become something else by sunset. Men removed their caps without being told. Women stood with arms folded against the cold, not from suspicion now, but from the ache of recognition. Some had brought family photographs. Some held folded letters. Some simply stared toward the open shaft as if listening for voices that were not speaking, yet were somehow being heard at last. Jonah Reed was helped down slowly by Sheriff Briggs and one of the road workers after the preservation team declared the stairs safe enough for one careful visitor at a time. Caleb offered his arm, but Jonah shook his head gently. "I have waited this long," the old man said. "I can take the last few steps." His cane tapped softly against the steel stairs, each tap small but certain. When he reached the chamber floor, he stood still for a long moment, breathing the cold underground air. Then his eyes found the wall. Samuel Reed. Third name from the top. Jonah raised one trembling hand but did not touch the paint. My mother used to say his name every night, he whispered. Not loud. Just enough so the house would remember him correctly. No one answered. There are moments when comfort would only make grief feel crowded. Rex rose, walked to Jonah, and pressed his head lightly against the old man's hand. Jonah looked down, startled, then rested his fingers between the dog's ears. His face softened in a way Caleb had not seen before, as if some locked room inside him had opened without a sound. Good shepherd, Jonah murmured. You brought him back. Ellen Porter found the final ledger just before dusk, wrapped in oilcloth inside the bottom drawer of Henry Ellison's desk. It was heavier than the others, bound in cracked brown leather, with Ellison Mining Company stamped on the cover in fading gold. Inside were signatures, payment records, inspection delays, and a series of warnings written months before the closure. Caleb stood beside her while she read, his jaw tight, his hands still. The truth was plain, not dramatic, not decorated, and that made it heavier. The 18 men had reported structural problems in the lower tunnels. They had refused to certify unsafe conditions. They had asked for repairs. The company had ignored them, then later turned their honesty into blame. Ellen closed the ledger with care, as if closing it too quickly might disrespect the years it had survived. This clears them, she said. Her voice was hoarse. Sheriff Briggs nodded, but his eyes were wet. Then we make it public. The words traveled up through the shaft by radio first, then by voice, then by the strange current that moves through a gathered crowd when something impossible becomes real. At the fence line, people began saying the names. Not all at once. Not loudly. One person recognized the grandfather. Another recognized a great-uncle. A woman from the diner said her grandmother had kept a miner's lunch pail in the attic but never explained why. Name by name, the old accusation began to loosen its grip on the town. Caleb climbed out last, after the archivists had sealed the first boxes and the chamber had been secured for the night. Rex came behind him, paws sure on the metal steps, his coat dusted lightly with the gray powder of the underground room. The sun had dropped behind Miller's Ridge, leaving the sky streaked with rose and lavender. The burned oak stood above them, black on one side, silver on the other where the evening light touched its bark. Jonah waited near the trunk. When Caleb reached him, the old man took the photograph from his coat pocket and held it out. You keep it for now, Jonah said. Margaret wanted you to carry this. Caleb looked at the 18 young faces beneath the living oak. For most of his life after the service, he had felt like a man walking away from everything, because staying anywhere long enough meant believing he could belong there. But now the field around him was full of people who had come not to take from the land, but to stand with what it had protected. Sheriff Briggs stepped beside him and looked over the hollow lot. You understand what this means, do you not? He asked. Caleb glanced down at Rex, who was sniffing the base of the burned oak where the first patch of green moss showed through the blackened roots. It means the truth gets daylight, Caleb said. Briggs nodded slowly. And it means this land is worth more than anyone thought. Caleb did not answer right away. Beyond the fence, headlights lined the road like candles. In the cooling air, the field no longer smelled only of iron and wet clay. Somewhere beneath that, faint but real, came the clean scent of underground water moving through stone. Rex lifted his head as if he heard it too. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's back and felt, for the first time in years, that the ground beneath him was not asking him to leave. It was asking him to stay. The next morning, Ashford Hollow woke to the kind of silence that comes after a long storm has finally passed, even though no thunder had rolled through the night. Something heavier had moved instead, something old and buried, and by sunrise the town seemed to understand that it would not be the same place by evening. Caleb slept for 3 hours in the cab of his truck, parked beneath the ridge with Rex curled across the passenger seat, his head resting near Caleb's hand. When Caleb opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the burned oak standing beyond the windshield, black against a pearl-colored sky. For a moment, he did not know whether the tightness in his chest came from weariness or from the strange peace of having stayed. He had spent years leaving before roots could find him. Now a piece of land everyone else had avoided had held him in place through the night, and he had not wanted to run from it. By 8 o'clock, county officials, state historians, and legal representatives had set up folding tables near the old fence. They laid out copies of the documents recovered from the underground archive, each one sealed, photographed, and catalogued. The names of the 18 miners were read into public record before noon. No speech could have prepared the town for the sound of those names spoken without shame. Samuel Reed, Thomas Avery, Lewis Mercer, Daniel Pike, Henry Wallace. One after another, the names rose into the morning air and drifted across the field, not like accusations anymore, but like birds finally released from a closed room. Jonah Reed stood beside Caleb, one hand on his cane, the other resting on Rex's shoulders. The old man's face was pale from the cold, but his eyes were bright and steady. When his father's name was read, he lowered his head, and Rex leaned into him with the quiet instinct of a creature who knew when a human heart needed weight beside it. Ellen Porter cried openly at the records table, though she kept writing through her tears. Sheriff Briggs stood near the gate, hat in hand, looking like a man who had inherited a sorrow and was only now learning how to set part of it down. By afternoon, news trucks arrived from Lexington and Louisville, but the town did not turn the moment into a spectacle. Briggs kept them beyond the fence, and Caleb gave no interview. He did not know how to explain what had happened in a way that would fit into a short answer. A dog had listened. A widow had trusted him. A field had opened. Men blamed for 70 years had been returned to their families with their names made whole. None of that belonged to the language of headlines. It belonged to the slower language of hands held at a fence line, old photographs brought from attics, and strangers realizing they had been neighbors to the same wound all along. Near 3 o'clock, a black SUV rolled up the gravel road, polished so clean it looked out of place beside the mud and pasture grass. A man in a charcoal coat stepped out with 2 assistants and introduced himself as a representative of a regional development group. He spoke politely, almost gently, and said the company had reviewed preliminary reports about the underground spring, the historic mine access, and the mineral rights attached to the property. His words were careful, but everyone near enough to hear understood what he meant. The land no one wanted had become valuable overnight. He offered to begin purchase negotiations immediately, saying the site could be developed into a private resort, a bottled water operation, or a heritage attraction under professional management. The number he mentioned was large enough to make several people turn and stare at Caleb. For a man who had slept in his truck, it was the kind of number that could change every practical thing about life. New house. New truck. Warm rooms. Paid bills. Quiet winters. Caleb looked across the field at the open shaft, now guarded and covered, then at the burned oak, then at Rex sitting beneath it with his ears lifted toward the wind. He thought of Margaret Ellison alone in her old house, carrying a truth too heavy for her body but not too heavy for her conscience. He thought of Henry Ellison building an archive underground because daylight had become dangerous for honesty. He thought of 18 families told to live beneath a lie because men with money had feared poor men with proof. The representative waited with a patient smile. Caleb took the business card he offered, held it for a moment, then slipped it into his coat without looking at the number again. "This land is not for clearing," he said. "Not like that." The man blinked, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Caleb's voice remained calm. "There may be a way to use the spring. There may be a way to preserve the archive and let people learn from it. But nobody is going to bury this place a second time under something shiny." A quiet sound moved through the people behind him, not applause, not yet, but breath returning. Jonah Reed smiled faintly. Ellen wiped her face and kept her eyes on her notebook as if afraid she might cry again. Sheriff Briggs placed his hat back on his head and looked toward the ridge, where sunlight had begun to pour through the clouds in long golden bands. The development man nodded with practiced disappointment, and said they would remain interested if Caleb changed his mind. Caleb thanked him and watched the SUV leave the same way it had come, clean tires slowly gathering hollow lot mud. As evening settled, the town gathered at the fence without being asked. Someone brought a wooden board from the church basement. Someone else brought white paint. By lantern light, Ellen wrote the 18 names carefully, one beneath another, while Jonah watched every stroke. Caleb stood back with Rex at his side, the cold settling into his jacket, the smell of wet clay and clean underground water rising around him. When the board was placed at the base of the burned oak, the wind moved through the field, and for the first time since Caleb had arrived, the oak did not seem like a warning. It seemed like a witness. Rex stepped forward, sniffed the fresh paint, then lay down beside the names with his head on his paws. Caleb looked at the dog, at the people, at the land that had carried both shame and proof in the dark for longer than most lives lasted. He had thought the inheritance was 12 acres of unwanted dirt. But as the lanterns glowed softly against the coming night, he began to understand that the true inheritance was responsibility, and perhaps that was why Margaret had not chosen a rich man, or a powerful man, or a man with an easy life. She had chosen someone who knew what it meant to be misread by the world and still keep walking gently through it. Spring came slowly to Ashford Hollow, not with a sudden burst of color, but with small mercies that appeared one by one until the town realized winter had loosened its hand. The first green showed beneath the burned oak in early March, a thin seam of grass pushing through the dark soil where nothing had grown for as long as anyone could remember. Jonah Reed was the first to notice it. He had come with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair, as he did most mornings now, and he stood for several minutes looking down at the tender blades as if they were a message written in a language older than words. Rex noticed too. The German shepherd stepped carefully around the new grass, lowered his nose, and breathed it in with the solemn attention he gave to important things. Caleb watched from beside the old fence, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, feeling the cold lift from the field in slow invisible layers. The hollow lot was changing, but not in the way developers had imagined. No bulldozers came to flatten it. No gates went up to keep ordinary people away. The underground archive was reinforced, catalogued, and protected by the state as a historic site. The spring on the east side of the property was tested, certified clean, and leased through a small local partnership whose profits were directed into a fund Caleb created with Ellen Porter and Sheriff Briggs. They named it the Rex Hollow Foundation, though Caleb resisted at first, saying Rex had never asked for anything but food, room to run, and the passenger seat of the truck. Jonah had smiled and said that was exactly why the name fit. The foundation did 3 things. It helped descendants of the 18 miners with records, memorial costs, and family claims. It supported homeless veterans passing through the county with temporary housing, tools, and honest work. And it cared for retired service dogs whose bodies had grown older than their courage. The first cabin built on the land was not large, just cedar walls, a tin roof, a ramp instead of steps, and a porch facing the ridge. Caleb built most of it himself with help from townspeople who once would have driven past the hollow lot without slowing down. Men who had not spoken to one another in years stood shoulder to shoulder measuring boards. Women from the church brought soup, biscuits, and old quilts. Teenagers painted fence rails under Ellen's watchful eye. Sheriff Briggs came after his shifts and wired the porch lights, claiming he was rusty, though every connection held. By May, there were 3 cabins, a gravel walking path, a small records room above ground, and a simple memorial beneath the burned oak. The board with the 18 names had been replaced by a carved stone marker, but Caleb kept the original board in the records room because Jonah said the first writing mattered. It had been done by hand, in lantern light, by people still learning how to tell the truth. On the day of the dedication, the whole town gathered in the field. American flags moved gently along the fence line. Folding chairs faced the oak. The spring wind carried the smell of cut grass, cedar sawdust, and coffee from the diner's silver urns. Caleb stood near the back with Rex, hoping not to be asked to speak, but Jonah found him anyway. The old man wore a dark suit that hung a little loose on his frame and a blue tie his granddaughter had chosen. He placed one hand on Caleb's arm and said, "Some men spend their lives looking for land to own. You found land that asked you to belong." Caleb looked away toward the ridge because some truths were easier to hear when not looking directly at the person who said them. When the 18 names were read aloud, no one lowered their eyes. Families stood when they heard their own. Some cried softly. Some held photographs. Some simply breathed, as if a weight had finally lifted from rooms far beyond that field. When Samuel Reed's name came, Jonah stood tall with Rex beside him, the dog's shoulder pressed gently against his leg. Later, Ellen opened Margaret Ellison's final letter, the one she had instructed the lawyer to release only after the dedication. Caleb read it alone beneath the oak as afternoon light spread gold across the grass. Margaret wrote that she had been afraid for most of her life, but fear had never once made the truth disappear. It had only made the silence heavier. She wrote that when Caleb fixed her porch in the rain and refused payment, she saw in him a man who had lost much but not his gentleness. And when Rex rested his head on her knee, she believed, with the strange certainty old age sometimes grants, that the land would finally be heard. Caleb folded the letter carefully, and stood there for a long time. Rex lay in the grass nearby, his muzzle graying, his eyes half closed in the sun. Beyond them, the cabins glowed warm against the trees. A veteran from Tennessee sat on one porch with a retired Labrador at his feet. A widow traced her father's name on the memorial stone. Children walked the path with paper cups of lemonade, their laughter no longer sounding out of place on that ground. Caleb had once thought peace would arrive like a door opening all at once. Instead, it came like this: a dog sleeping in clean grass, a town saying the right names, a roof built by many hands, an old wrong finally losing its hold. As evening settled, Caleb sat beneath the burned oak and Rex rested his head on his boot. The field breathed around them, no longer hollow, no longer unwanted. The land had kept the truth until kindness came close enough to dig, and what rose from the dark was not only proof, or history, or money. It was a home.